We begin, as we always do, with the plain truth of a woman's life, because the plain truth is where every quiet miracle starts. At 44 years old, Ada Mercer owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a tin trunk with a broken latch, and $31 folded into a handkerchief that had once belonged to her mother. Her husband's brother, Thomas Mercer, had put her off the family land not 3 weeks after the burying, telling the whole of Millrace Crossing that a widow with no children and no deed in her own name had no business keeping a house that, by his reckoning, belonged to the Mercer name and not to her grief. She did not argue. She had learned long before that arguing with a man who has already decided the shape of the world does no good at all. So she took her $31 and she walked down to the river, where the county was auctioning off, for want of any other bidder, the old abandoned ferry landing at the bend below town, a rotted dock, a collapsed shed, and a right-of-way nobody living even remembered the use of, and she paid $12 for the whole ruin of it, which the auctioneer himself called money thrown into the water. It was by every measure the town could offer, a foolish and desperate purchase. But beneath those gray, split planks, sealed away in the dark and the damp for the better part of 40 years, there waited a wedding chest that no living soul had opened, and what it held inside would not only change the whole shape of Ada Mercer's life. It would call the entire town of Millrace Crossing back from the brink of forgetting who it truly was. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ada Mercer. If you are watching this from a town that feels like it has been passed over by time, or from a home that no longer feels like it belongs to you, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are settling in from tonight. Ada had not always been a woman who counted coins in a handkerchief. She had been raised 20 miles upriver, in a river-trading family who understood, better than most, that value was rarely where the world expected it to be. Her father, Warwick Doyle, had run a small flatboat trade along the Kestrel River, hauling grain and salt and bolts of cloth to landings that grander merchants considered beneath their notice. And he had taught his daughter, from the time she could walk the deck without falling, that the poorest-looking cargo sometimes carried the richest profit if a person only troubled themselves to look close and look twice. He used to say that any fool could see the worth of a thing already polished and priced. It took a sharper eye to see worth in a thing the world had already decided to throw away. Ada had grown up sorting through cast-off crates for what other traders missed, mending nets that other hands called ruined, coaxing a second season out of tools that other families had left to rust. It was not a glamorous education, but it was an honest one, and it gave her hands the particular patience of someone who has learned that neglect is not the same thing as worthlessness. She met Caleb Mercer at 17, when his family's freight wagons stopped at her father's landing to trade for salted pork, and she liked him for the plain reason that he listened to her the way her father listened to the river, carefully, and as though he expected to learn something. They married 2 years later in a small chapel in Millrace Crossing, the town where the Mercer family had settled 2 generations back, and for 18 years they built a modest, steady life together on a leased parcel at the edge of town, raising a little corn, a little livestock, and mending harness leather for half the county when the money ran thin. They had no children who lived past infancy, a sorrow Ada carried quietly and never let harden her. And when Caleb's health began to fail in his 49th year, worn down by a wet cough that no doctor in 3 counties could cure, Ada nursed him herself through 2 long winters, selling off first the extra livestock, then the good harness tools, then her own mother's silver spoons, to pay for tonics and blankets and coal. She never once complained where anyone could hear her. She had learned that, too, from her father, that dignity was often the only inheritance a poor family could still afford to keep, and that a person guarded it the way they guarded anything precious, quietly and without display. When Caleb died in the spring of his 51st year, Ada believed, in her grief, that the worst of it was behind her. She did not yet understand that grief, in a town like Millrace Crossing, could be treated by some as an opportunity. Thomas Mercer, Caleb's younger brother, had never much cared for Ada. He had wanted Caleb to marry into the Belrose family, whose name sat over half the storefronts on Main Street, and he had never forgiven his brother for choosing a river trader's daughter instead. With Caleb gone, Thomas produced an old, half-legible lease agreement, drawn up years before between his father and Caleb, and declared that the land Ada and Caleb had lived on for 18 years had never truly passed to Caleb at all, but remained, in the strictest reading of the paper, Mercer family property, which was to say, Thomas's property, now that he was the last Mercer standing who cared to claim it. The town's aging notary, a tired man named Prentice Gale, who owed the Belrose family more favors than he could count, upheld the claim without much fuss. Ada was given 3 weeks to vacate a house she had scrubbed and mended and loved for the better part of 2 decades, and not one neighbor in Millrace Crossing thought it worth the trouble of speaking against a Mercer on behalf of a woman who, after all, had brought nothing to the marriage but her own 2 hands. She did not weep in front of them. She packed her tin trunk, folded her mother's handkerchief around what money remained, and walked out of the only home she had known as a wife with her chin held level, because her father had taught her that too, that the world takes a great deal from a person over a lifetime, but cannot take the way you choose to carry yourself out the door. It was on the 3rd day of her wandering, with no clear notion of where a widow with $31 might go, that Ada heard the county auctioneer's bell down by the river and drifted toward it, less from hope than from the old habit of watching what other people threw away. The parcel on the block that afternoon was the old Ferry landing at Widow's Bend, though it had not carried that name because of her. The Bend had been called that for decades, after another widow entirely, a coincidence Ada would only later come to understand was not quite a coincidence at all. The landing had once, long before Ada's time in Millrace Crossing, been the only crossing point on the Kestrel River for 11 miles in either direction, run by a ferryman named Josiah Vane and his family, until a flood and a change in the county road charter had sent all the traffic to a new bridge built 2 miles downstream, and the old landing had simply been left to the water and the weather ever since. The dock boards had silvered and split. The ferry shed had lost half its roof to a windstorm nobody, now living quite remembered. The rope works had rotted into the mud. It was, the auctioneer said with a small, apologetic laugh, hardly worth the paper of the deed, and he would take any bid at all just to close the county's books on it. Nobody raised a hand. Ada raised hers and offered $12, and the auctioneer, faintly startled, accepted before she could think better of it. A few onlookers chuckled. One man muttered that the widow had gone and thrown good money after a bad husband's memory. Ada said nothing to any of them. She only walked down to the landing that same afternoon, alone, with the last of the daylight silvering the water, and stood on the rotted boards of a dock that now, however foolishly, belonged entirely to her. The shed door hung crooked on one hinge, and inside she found little more than a rusted lantern, a coil of ruined rope, and the smell of 40 years of damp wood. But it was the dock itself that held her attention longest, because as she walked its length testing each board with her weight the way her father had taught her to test a flatboat's planking before trusting it with cargo, she found one board near the shoreward end that did not lie flat against its neighbors, but sat raised at one corner, as though it had been lifted and set back many times by careful hands rather than warped by weather alone. She knelt, worked her fingers beneath its edge, and pried it loose, and beneath it, in a shallow pit lined with tar paper and packed straw to keep out the river damp, she found chest. It was not large, perhaps 2 feet across, but it was finely made, of cedar gone dark with age, its brass corners tarnished nearly black, and across its lid someone had once burned, with a hot iron, 2 sets of initials twined together inside a carved ring of river reeds. Evie and DC Ada sat back on her heels in the fading light and understood, before she even lifted the lid, that she was looking at a wedding chest, the kind of family packed with linens and keepsakes and small treasures in. The months before a daughter's marriage, meant to travel with the bride into her new life, and yet had never traveled anywhere at all. It had been hidden beneath a dock and left there, sealed and untouched, for what looked to her practiced the better part of 4 decades. The latch was rusted through, and it took her the better part of an hour, working by lantern light with a bent nail from the shed, to spring it without splitting the old wood. When at last the lid gave way, the smell of cedar and dried lavender rose up out of the dark, faint but unmistakable, as though the years inside had been holding their breath. On top lay a folded quilt, its pattern of wedding rings stitched in blues and creams, still soft despite its age, and beneath the quilt, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the river's damp, Ada found a leather ledger book, a small tin box of coins, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon the color of dried roses. She did not read them that first night. She was too tired and too wary of a discovery that felt, in the hush of the empty landing, almost too private to touch. She only closed the lid, carried the chest into the leaning shed, and sat beside it until the moon rose over the Kestrel River, thinking of her father's old words about cargo that carried more worth than anyone troubled to look for. She had bought a ruin for $12. She had not expected the ruin to be keeping a secret. It was the following morning, with proper daylight to see by, that Ada allowed herself to read. The ledger book, she found, had belonged to Josiah Vane, the ferryman who had once run the crossing, and its pages, in a careful, slanting hand, recorded decades of tolls and repairs and the ordinary business of a working landing. Until, near the final pages, the entries changed in character entirely. Josiah had begun writing not of tolls, but of a betrayal. He described, in plain and bitter language, how a rising merchant of the town, named Elias Belrose, ancestor, Ada realized with a small, cold jolt, of the very Belrose family whose name Thomas Mercer so admired, had used his growing influence on the county road board to have the new bridge charter routed 2 miles downstream from the Vane landing, ensuring that all future toll traffic and trade would pass through land that Belrose himself had quietly bought up in advance. Josiah had fought the decision before the county board and lost, ruined by a man who had known exactly where the new crossing would go before anyone else in town did. The letters, when Ada untied their faded ribbon, told the more painful half of the story. They were love letters dated across 2 years, written between Josiah's daughter, Eliza Vane, and a young surveyor's assistant named Daniel Crum, who had worked, in a bitter irony, for the very road board that would ruin her father. Eliza and Daniel had planned to marry in the autumn of 1846, and the wedding chest had been packed and prepared for that very autumn. The coins in the tin box, Ada now understood, were Eliza's small dowry, saved coin by coin from Ferry tolls, and the quilt was her mother's parting gift. But the last letter in the bundle, written in a different, more halting hand than the others, was not from Eliza to Daniel at all. It was Eliza's own account, penned to no one in particular, of how the wedding had never taken place. How Daniel, upon learning that his employer Elias Belrose intended to ruin the Vane family's livelihood entirely, had tried to warn the county board and had been dismissed from his post and quietly driven from Millrace Crossing before the wedding could occur, and how Eliza, believing rumors spread by Belrose's own hand that Daniel had abandoned her out of cowardice, had hidden the chest beneath the dock in grief and shame rather than let the town see a bride left waiting, and had left the crossing not long after with a broken father, never to return. Ada sat a long while with that last letter in her hands, feeling the particular ache of a story that had been silenced not by cruelty alone, but by the small, ordinary lies that cruelty tells to protect itself. She understood, reading it, that Elias Belrose had not simply outmaneuvered a rival merchant. He had destroyed a family, engineered a young man's disgrace, and let a broken-hearted young woman believe herself abandoned. Also that his own land might sit astride the only profitable crossing on the river. And she understood, with a colder recognition, that the family which now ran half of Millrace Crossing's storefronts, the family Thomas Mercer so wished he had married into, had built its fortune on exactly that foundation. She did not, in that first raw morning, know what she meant to do with what she had found. She knew only that she could not, in good conscience, fold the letters back into their oiled cloth and pretend she had found nothing but old linens. Word travels quickly along a river, and it was not many days before the town of Millrace Crossing learned that the widow Mercer, for she was still spoken of that way, though she claimed no Mercer land any longer, had taken up residence at the derelict ferry landing and begun, with her own 2 hands, clearing brush from the old right-of-way and patching the collapsed roof of the ferry shed with salvaged lumber. Some found it a curiosity. Others, particularly those who did business with the Belrose family's downstream bridge toll house, found it a nuisance worth discouraging. It was Mayor Absalom Belrose himself, grandson of Elias, a broad, courteous man who wore his family's old prosperity the way some men wear a fine coat, who came down to the landing one afternoon to explain to Ada, in tones of great and patient kindness, that the county's bridge charter forbade any competing crossing within 3 miles of the existing span, that her little dock could never legally run a ferry again, and that she would do better, for her own sake, to sell the worthless parcel back to the county, or, he added, almost as an afterthought, to his own family, who would pay her a fair price out of simple neighborly concern for a widow's welfare. Ada thanked him for his concern and told him she had not yet decided what she meant to do with the landing. She did not mention the chest, but the mayor's visit and the particular nervousness with which he had glanced toward the old dock boards while making it told Ada something she had begun to suspect on her own, that the Belrose family had not forgotten what lay, or once lay, buried at Widow's Bend, and that they had perhaps spent 40 years hoping the river would quietly finish the job of erasing it. She began, after that, to move more carefully. She copied the ledger's key pages by hand and hid the copies among her own few belongings, keeping the original chest itself buried again beneath a different, unmarked board, telling no one, not even the kindly old river pilot, Hosea Finn, who had begun stopping by most mornings to help her with the heavier repairs, exactly what she had found. It was Hosea, in fact, who first told her the county records existed to be searched by anyone willing to sit through the tedious hours of it, and it was Hosea who rode her downriver to the county seat at Alderton to do exactly that. There, in the dust of the recorder's office, Ada found the old bridge charter petitions from 1846 and confirmed, in cold official language, everything Josiah Vane's ledger had already told her in grief, that Elias Belrose had personally purchased the downstream parcel 8 months before the charter vote, under a cousin's name to disguise the conflict of interest, and had lobbied 3 of the 5 county commissioners with gifts of land and livestock recorded, with careless honesty, in his own private account books, which by strange fortune had been filed alongside the public charter papers and never once removed. It was not proof that would satisfy a modern court in every particular, but it was proof enough, laid beside Eliza's letters and her father's ledger, to tell the true story of Widow's Bend to anyone willing to read it. When she returned to Millrace Crossing, Ada found that Thomas Mercer, perhaps sensing which way the wind now blew, had grown suddenly and uncharacteristically interested in buying the ferry landing from her himself, offering a sum 3 times what she had paid, which told her more plainly than any ledger could that the land, and what it implied, was worth a great deal more to the Belrose family's peace of mind than $12 or even $36. She declined his offer with the same quiet courtesy she had shown Mayor Belrose, and it was not long after that the trouble began in earnest. Someone tore down, in the night, the new fencing Hosea had helped her raise around the shed. The county assessor, a cousin of Prentice Gale, suddenly discovered an old unpaid tax lien against the landing dating from years before Ada had ever bought it, and threatened to seize the parcel outright unless it was settled within the month, a sum Ada did not have and had no honest way of raising. Whispers moved through town that the widow Mercer had gone strange out at the old landing, digging in the mud like a woman half out of her senses, and a few of the more devout ladies of the church began to cross the street rather than greet her, uncertain what to make of a woman who seemed to want nothing the town could offer and yet would not simply disappear as expected. Ada bore all of it the way she had learned to bear things, without complaint and without retreat, but she understood, watching the tax notice sit on the shed's one sound table, that quiet patience alone would not save the landing this time. She needed the town itself to hear what she had found, and she needed it to hear the truth before the Belrose family could bury it a second time. She chose, in the end, not a courtroom, which she could not afford, nor a newspaper, which the county's only paper would not dare print against the Belrose name. She chose the town meeting hall itself, on the evening the county assessor had scheduled to formally announce the lien, when half of Millrace Crossing would already be gathered to watch, as they thought, a stubborn widow finally lose her foolish little ruin. Ada arrived with Hosea Finn beside her, carrying not a lawyer's brief, but the wedding chest itself, its cedar lid scrubbed clean, and set it on the table before the assembled county board and the curious, murmuring townsfolk, and asked only that they let her speak before the lien was read. She told them, in the same plain, unhurried voice her father had once used to describe a fair trade, the story the chest had been keeping for 40 years, of Josiah Vane and his ruined crossing, of Eliza and Daniel, and a wedding that never was, of Elias Belrose's cousin's name on a land deed 8 months too early, of gifts to commissioners recorded in his own careless hand. She read from the ledger. She read, with visible difficulty, one short passage of Eliza's own grieving words, and she watched the room's disbelief soften, board by board, into a silence that was not the silence of doubt, but the silence of people recognizing, uncomfortably, a story they had half known all along and simply never troubled to ask about. Mayor Absalom Belrose, standing near the back of the hall, went the color of old ash, and when old Prentice Gale, the notary, was asked directly by a county commissioner whether he recognized the account books Ada now held up, he could not, in front of so many watching neighbors, bring himself to lie. The lien was quietly withdrawn that same evening, the assessor suddenly discovering, under the weight of so many eyes, a clerical error in his own paperwork. But it was not, in truth, the lien that mattered most to Ada, nor even the slow, grudging apology that eventually reached her, weeks later, in the form of a county resolution restoring full and undisputed title of the widow's Bend landing to her name. What mattered, and what she asked for instead of any payment or apology, was that the county charter's 3-mile restriction be reconsidered, and that widow's Bend be permitted, for the first time in 4 decades, to run a small ferry again, to serve the farms and families on the western bank who had for years been forced to travel 2 extra miles around to reach the Belrose Bridge and its ever-rising tolls. She asked, too, that a portion of the coins found in Eliza Vane's dowry chest, for there had been, among the tarnished coins, more silver than a young bride's savings alone could easily explain, likely tucked away by Josiah himself against harder days, be put not into her own pocket, but into rebuilding the old landing's road and dock properly, so that it might serve the town rather than any one family's fortune. The county board, chastened and eager to be seen doing right by a wronged widow rather than a grasping one, agreed to all of it. Thomas Mercer, whose own fortunes had always leaned rather more on Belrose's goodwill than he liked to admit, found himself with considerably less standing in mill race, crossing once the Belrose name had been quietly humbled, and he made no further claim on Ada's time or her land. Mayor Belrose did not lose his office by any formal vote. The town was not so quick to unmake 40 years of habit, but he lost, plainly and permanently, the easy authority of a man whose family's word had never once been questioned, and something in the town's regard for him thereafter carried a wariness it had not carried before. It was, Ada thought, watching him leave the hall that night with his shoulders set in a stiffness that had not been there when he arrived, its own quiet kind of justice, not loud, not vindictive, but the sort that settles, over years, into the shape a family's name, is finally permitted to wear in a town that has stopped looking away. And so, it was that the woman who had walked away from her home with $31 and a broken tin trunk found herself, less than a year later, standing once more on the mended boards of a dock she had bought for $12 because no one else in the county had believed it worth a second glance. The new ferry, small and modest, carried its first crossing on a bright spring morning with half the western farms turned out to see it, and Hosea Finn at the tiller, and Ada Mercer standing at the shoreline in the same plain dress she had worn the day she pried up a rotted board and found a story the river had been keeping safe. She thought, watching the little ferry glide out across the Kestrel's current, of her father's old saying about cargo that carried more worth than anyone troubled to look for, and she understood, at last, that he had not only meant crates and bolts of cloth. He had meant chests buried beneath forgotten planks. He had meant ferry landings nobody wanted. He had meant, she suspected, women like herself, cast off and undervalued by people too hurried or too proud to look twice. And she understood, too, that the true inheritance Eliza Vane had left buried at Widow's Bend was never really the coins at all, but the chance for someone, someday, to finally tell her story honestly, and to let that honesty put right what greed had once broken. The landing prospers still, in the account of it that has come down to us. Run now as a modest toll-free crossing under the town's own care, with a small marker at its shoreward end bearing two names carved into cedar toned stone, Eliza Vane and Daniel Crum, who never had the wedding the chest was packed for, but whose story, once finally spoken aloud, gave a whole town back its honest crossing. Ada Mercer never remarried, never sought wealth for what she found, and lived out her years in a small house within sight of the river she had come to love as her father had loved it before her, remembered by Mill Race Crossing not as a foolish widow who threw good money after a ruin, but as the woman who looked twice at what everyone else had already decided to throw away. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Ada Mercer's story. If it moved you, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often carry more worth than the world first gives them credit for. Before you go, we would love to hear your answer to this. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us below, and let us carry one another's stories a little further. Until next time, stay close.